At her own engagement party, in front of 300 guests, Vanessa Sterling knocked a silver tray from the hands of a maid named Naomi Carter and slapped her hard across the face. The music stopped. The room went silent. Vanessa smiled, certain she had just taught a servant her place. But Naomi did not cry. She did not step back. She simply turned her head, slow and steady, and looked Vanessa dead in the eye. What happened in the next 60 seconds would end an engagement, expose a secret, and change everything for everyone watching. If stories like this keep you hooked until the very last word, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this channel brings you a new one every single week. Before that slap ever landed, Naomi Carter was the kind of person most guests at the Whitmore estate walked past without a second glance. She moved through the mansion in a pale pink uniform, her hair always pulled back, her steps quiet enough that trays of crystal glasses never so much as clinked in her hands. She had learned long ago that the safest place in a room like this was the edge of it, and for 3 years she had made that edge her home. What none of the guests knew, and what even the Whitmore family had never asked, was that Naomi had not always lived quietly. Long before she folded linens and polished silver, she had spent 8 years training in close combat and personal protection, learning to read a room for danger the way other people read it for gossip. She had been good at it, good enough that a single mistake during one assignment left another person seriously hurt, and good enough that the weight of that mistake never fully left her. After that night, she made herself a promise that her hands would never again be used to hurt anyone, and she walked away from that life without looking back. Becoming a maid was not the fall it might have looked like to someone glancing at her resume. For Naomi, it was closer to a rescue she had built for herself, a way to disappear into a life that asked nothing of her except steady hands and a steady heart. Nobody in this world expected a woman in a maid's uniform to have once been trained to break an attacker's wrist in under 2 seconds, and that invisibility was exactly what she wanted. Ethan Whitmore was the one person in the house who never quite let her stay invisible. At 33, he had already stepped into most of the responsibilities of his family's real estate empire, and the weight of that showed on the nights he could not sleep. On those nights, he would wander down to the kitchen long after the rest of the house had gone dark, usually to find Naomi still finishing some small task, and more often than not, the two of them would end up talking for an hour with nothing but a pot of coffee between them. "You're the only person in this house who doesn't want something from me," Ethan admitted one night, sitting on a stool across the kitchen island while Naomi dried a stack of dishes that did not really need drying anymore. "That's because I already have what I want," Naomi answered, not looking up from her work. "A quiet life. You're not standing in the way of that." He laughed at that, low and tired, and told her she had a strange way of putting people at ease. What he did not say, though she suspected he felt it, was that their conversations had become the one part of his day that felt honest. She never asked him for anything, never flattered him, never treated his last name like a password to something better. She simply listened, the way she once listened for danger. Except now she was listening for a man slowly cracking under the pressure of everyone else's expectations. Vanessa Sterling was not in the kitchen for those conversations, and that was exactly the problem. She was Ethan's fiancée, a woman who had built her entire identity around being seen, admired, and envied, and she measured her worth by how many rooms turned to look at her when she walked in. To Vanessa, household staff were simply part of the scenery, furniture that happened to move and occasionally speak when spoken to. She had never once asked Naomi's name before the night everything changed, though she had certainly noticed her. It started as small observations that Vanessa could not quite let go of. Ethan smiled more easily when Naomi walked into a room. He remembered small details Naomi mentioned in passing, the way her mother used to make coffee, a book she had read twice, while he regularly forgot things Vanessa had told him only days before. Vanessa told herself a maid could never be real competition, and yet the thought kept circling back, sharper each time, because what bothered her was never really about attraction. It was about respect, the kind Ethan gave freely to a woman who owned nothing, while Vanessa had to perform for every ounce of it she received. That quiet resentment did not stay quiet for long. Vanessa began finding small ways to remind Naomi of her place. the kind of cruelty that never left a mark anyone else could see. She would ask Naomi to redo tasks that had already been done perfectly, spill wine near a rug she knew Naomi had just finished cleaning, or speak about the help in front of Naomi as though she were a piece of furniture incapable of hearing her own name. Naomi absorbed all of it without complaint, telling herself that a little humiliation was a small price for the peace she had built, and that reacting would only invite the kind of attention she could never afford. The real trouble began the afternoon Vanessa found herself paging through the household's personnel files, ostensibly checking references before the wedding, though her real interest had narrowed to one name. She found employment history, a background check, and then 3 years with nothing listed at all, no job title, no employer, no explanation. To Vanessa, that gap did not read as a woman quietly starting over. It read as a woman hiding something dangerous, and she decided almost immediately that this gap was a door she could use. She brought it up not to Ethan, but directly to Naomi, cornering her one afternoon in the narrow hallway outside the pantry. 3 years missing from your file, Vanessa said, holding the folder like a blade. Most people don't disappear like that unless they're running from something or hiding what they used to be. Which is it? Naomi felt her stomach tighten, though her face gave away nothing. It's private, she said simply. It has nothing to do with this house or with Ethan. Everything in this house has something to do with Ethan, Vanessa said, stepping closer. And if I decide those 3 years are worth mentioning to his family, worth mentioning to people who matter, your quiet little life here disappears a lot faster than you think. She did not wait for a response. She simply let the threat sit in the air and walked away, confident she had planted something that would keep Naomi small and obedient. That threat worked exactly as Vanessa intended for a while. Naomi kept her head down even more carefully after that, terrified that any misstep would give Vanessa the excuse to dig further, to find the truth buried under that gap instead of the vague suspicion she already carried. What Naomi feared most was not losing her job. It was the possibility of her old life resurfacing in a house where she had finally started to feel safe. The night before the engagement party, Vanessa cornered her again, this time outside the grand hall where staff were setting up chairs and floral arrangements for the following evening. Her voice was low, almost pleasant, which somehow made it worse. I know you're trying to take him from me, she said. I've watched the way he looks at you, the way he forgets I'm even in the room. Tomorrow night, in front of everyone who matters in Boston, you are going to remember exactly what you are. Naomi kept her voice even, though her pulse had quickened. I have never tried to take anything from you, she said. I work here. That's all this is. I don't want an explanation, Vanessa cut in. I want you to understand that tomorrow you're going to be a lesson, not a person. Ethan is never going to look at you the way he does now, not after I'm finished. What Naomi did not know, and would not learn until later, was that Ethan had come looking for a stack of table settings and had caught the last few sentences of that exchange from just around the corner. He heard enough to feel a cold unease settle into his chest, though not enough to understand what exactly Vanessa meant by a lesson. He told himself it was probably nothing, some disagreement between two women who had never particularly liked each other, and he did not mention it to either of them that night. It was a small, forgivable hesitation that would come to matter a great deal more than he realized. Naomi walked away from that hallway with a decision already forming inside her, one she did not speak aloud to anyone. She had spent years choosing silence over conflict, believing that peace meant absorbing whatever was thrown at her without flinching. But something about the certainty in Vanessa's voice, the casual cruelty of being called a lesson instead of a person, cracked something in that belief. She would not seek out a confrontation. She still meant to keep the promise she had made to herself all those years ago. But for the first time since she had put that old life behind her, Naomi promised herself something new. If Vanessa crossed a line that could not be walked back, she would not simply stand there and let it happen. She did not know yet how close that line truly was, or how quickly the next evening would ask her to choose between the woman who cleaned up quietly after other people's messes and the woman she used to be before she ever picked up a tray. The grand hall of the Whitmore estate had been transformed for the occasion, its usual quiet elegance replaced by chandeliers turned up to full brightness and enough white orchids to fill a greenhouse. 300 guests moved through the space in tuxedos and gowns that cost more than most people made in a year. A gathering of business owners, city officials, minor celebrities, and a handful of reporters who covered Boston's wealthiest families the way other reporters covered politics. Somewhere among the servers weaving through the crowd with trays of champagne, Naomi kept her eyes low and her steps light, doing everything in her power to stay exactly where Vanessa would not think to look. Vanessa, for her part, looked like a woman who had been rehearsing this exact night in her head for months. Her gown had been altered twice to fit perfectly, her hair styled by someone flown in from New York, and every gesture she made seemed calibrated for maximum effect. This was the night she would stop being merely engaged to a Whitmore and start being seen as one, and she intended for every person in that room to understand her value before dessert was served. Ethan stood at the center of it all, delivering a short toast about gratitude and new beginnings, his voice carrying easily across the hall. Near the end of his remarks, his gaze drifted, almost without his permission, toward the back of the room where Naomi stood balancing a tray of empty glasses. He smiled, small and unguarded, the kind of smile a man gives someone he trusts rather than someone he is trying to impress. Vanessa saw it. She had spent the entire evening watching for exactly that kind of moment, and finding it confirmed everything she had already convinced herself was true. Combined with the champagne she had been drinking since the guests arrived and the pressure of holding herself together in front of everyone who mattered to her, something in her control simply gave way. She decided in that instant that she was done waiting for a private moment to teach Naomi her lesson. She crossed the dance floor with a purpose that made several guests step aside without quite understanding why, and reached Naomi before anyone could react. In one sharp motion, she knocked the tray from Naomi's hands, sending crystal glasses shattering against the marble floor loud enough to cut straight through the music. The band stopped almost immediately. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every head in the room turned toward the sound. "You've been trying to take him from me since the day I met you," Vanessa said, her voice pitched to carry, not to whisper. "A maid does not get to dream about a man like Ethan Whitmore. You don't get to have that." Naomi kept both hands open at her sides, aware of every eye now fixed on her. "Can we talk about this somewhere else?" she said quietly, hoping the offer alone might diffuse whatever was building in front of 300 witnesses. "No," Vanessa answered immediately. "I want everyone to see exactly what you are." Before Naomi could respond, Vanessa's hand cracked across her face, hard enough that the sound alone seemed to echo off the high ceiling. Naomi's head turned with the force of it, a red mark already blooming across her cheek, and for a moment she simply stood there absorbing the sting in silence. No one in the room made a sound. Vanessa smiled, certain she was about to watch Naomi break down in front of everyone who mattered. Instead, Naomi turned her head back slowly and looked directly at Vanessa with an expression that held no fear at all. Her eyes were calm in a way that did not match what had just happened to her, and that calm seemed to unsettle Vanessa more than tears ever could have. Something shifted in the air between them, though most of the guests could not have named what it was. Ethan started forward the moment the slap landed, but Vanessa threw up a hand without even looking at him. "Stay out of this," she said. "I'm simply teaching the help where they belong." Naomi kept her voice level, though something steadier had settled into it now. "You just struck me in front of 300 people," she said. "That's enough. Stop here." The warning, delivered without a trace of panic, seemed to strike Vanessa as a challenge rather than a request. Convinced that Naomi was trying to embarrass her further by refusing to react the way she expected, Vanessa raised her hand again, aiming for a second slap. This time, Naomi's hand shot up and caught her wrist in midair, stopping the blow inches from Naomi's own face. The speed of it drew an audible gasp from the guests closest to them. Vanessa yanked at her arm, expecting it to come free easily, but it did not move at all, as though her wrist had been locked inside something built from steel rather than skin. Naomi was not gripping hard enough to hurt her. She simply was not letting go. Panic and fury pushed Vanessa to swing her free hand toward Naomi's face. And that was the moment 8 years of training that Naomi had tried to leave behind reasserted itself, without her ever choosing violence. She redirected the incoming strike, turned her body with the force Vanessa had already put into motion, and brought her down to the marble floor in one continuous, controlled movement, careful enough that Vanessa landed without any real injury at all. Vanessa lay stunned on the cold floor, her gown twisted beneath her, all the poise she had built her entire evening around suddenly gone. Naomi knelt beside her with one knee on the ground, holding her wrists just firmly enough to prevent further movement, deliberately keeping her strength in reserve. She could have caused real damage in less than a second if she had wanted to. She did not. The room seemed to hold its breath, not only at what Naomi had just done, but at the obvious restraint behind it, a control that felt almost more shocking than the takedown itself. The instant Vanessa stopped struggling, Naomi released her grip and stepped back, putting distance between them immediately. She did not return the slap she had received only moments earlier, and somehow that single choice carried more weight in that room than any blow could have. Vanessa pushed herself upright, her face flushed with humiliation and rage, her carefully arranged hair now falling loose around her shoulders. "She attacked me," she said loud enough for the entire hall to hear. "Someone call security. I want her arrested, and I want everyone here to know she will never work in this city again." Ethan moved closer now, his expression caught somewhere between concern and confusion, looking from Vanessa to Naomi as though trying to piece together what he had just witnessed. Guests around them exchanged glances, whispers already beginning to spread through the crowd like static electricity. "Explain yourself," Ethan said quietly, though it was not entirely clear which of them he was speaking to. When neither woman answered right away, Vanessa seized the opening. "Ask her about the 3 years missing from her file," she said, pointing at Naomi with a shaking hand. 3 years with no job, no explanation, nothing. You don't hide something like that unless you're dangerous. I tried to warn you, Ethan. She's not who you think she is." Every eye in the hall shifted toward Naomi, waiting. She felt the weight of that silence pressing down harder than the slap ever had, and she understood, with a kind of quiet grief, that the private life she had spent years protecting was no longer hers to keep private. "Before I came to work in this house," Naomi said, her voice steady despite everything, "I spent 8 years training in close combat and personal protection. I was good at it. Good enough that during one assignment, a mistake I made left someone seriously hurt, and I decided afterward that I would never use my hands to harm another person again." She continued before anyone could interrupt her, needing to finish now that the truth was finally out in the open. "That's why I didn't stop the first slap. I was still holding on to that promise. But when she came at me a second time, I understood that staying silent wasn't peace anymore. It had become permission, and I wasn't willing to give her that." The admission hung in the air, heavier than the shattered glass still scattered across the marble floor. Somewhere behind her, Naomi could hear murmurs rippling outward through the crowd, guests turning to whisper to one another, trying to reconcile the quiet woman who refilled their champagne glasses with the composed, controlled figure who had just taken down Ethan's fiancée in front of all of them. Naomi understood, standing there in the wreckage of the moment, exactly what she stood to lose. Her job in this house, the small apartment that came with it, the reputation she had built as an ordinary, unremarkable woman, Ethan's trust, and perhaps most painfully, the right to decide for herself when and how her past would ever be revealed. All of it now belonged to whatever story this room chose to believe. She scanned the faces around her, searching for some sign of how this would be judged, uncertain whether they would see a woman who had shown extraordinary restraint under attack, or simply a maid who had proven herself far more dangerous than anyone in that house had ever imagined. For the first time since she had walked away from her old life, Naomi felt the quiet, careful world she had built for herself slipping out of her hands entirely, and she had no way of knowing yet whether anyone in that room was prepared to catch it. Vanessa did not wait for the whispers to settle before pressing her advantage. She turned to Ethan with the confidence of someone who still believed the room belonged to her, certain that the truth Naomi had just confessed would finish what the slap had started. "You heard her," she said. "She just admitted it herself. If you still want this wedding to happen, you fire her tonight. You call the police, and you stand here in front of everyone and choose me." Ethan said nothing at first, his eyes moving between the woman he was supposed to marry and the woman who had just knelt on the floor of his family's ballroom, holding back a violence she clearly could have unleashed at any moment. The silence stretched long enough that several guests near the front began shifting uncomfortably, unsure whether to look away or keep watching. Before Ethan could find the words to answer her, a slow, deliberate clapping sound broke the quiet, followed by the tap of a cane against marble. The crowd parted almost on instinct, and Harold Whitmore, Ethan's grandfather, stepped through the opening at 91 years old, his back straight and his eyes sharp despite his age. He had built the family's real estate empire from nothing more than a single construction loan, and even now, decades removed from daily operations, no one in that room would have dreamed of interrupting him. "I saw the whole thing," Harold said, his voice carrying without needing to be raised. "Every second of it, from the moment you knocked that tray out of her hands to the moment you accused her of attacking you." Vanessa's composure flickered for the first time that evening. "Harold, I don't think you understand what just—" "I understand perfectly well," he cut in, not unkindly, but without any room for argument. "You struck her first. You struck her a second time when she asked you to stop. She did not raise a hand against you until you gave her no other choice, and even then, she put you on the ground without so much as bruising you. That is not the behavior of someone trying to hurt you. That is the behavior of someone who knew exactly how much damage she was capable of doing and chose not to do it." A murmur moved through the crowd at that, quieter than the earlier whispers, more like the sound of people reconsidering something they thought they already understood. Harold turned slightly, addressing not just Vanessa but the room at large, his gaze sweeping over the guests who had spent the evening pretending not to watch. "I've lived in this house a long time," he continued, "long enough to see how people treat the ones who serve them when they think no one important is paying attention." He looked toward the staff still frozen near the edges of the hall, servers who had spent the night refilling glasses and clearing plates without a single guest bothering to learn their names. "I imagine tonight was not the first time some of you have seen Miss Sterling treat this staff the way she just treated Naomi." For a moment nobody moved. Then, from near the kitchen entrance, one of the younger servers set down her tray and stepped forward, her voice shaking slightly as she admitted that Vanessa had once thrown a plate at her feet over a delayed dessert course and told her she was lucky to have a job at all. Another staff member followed, describing being screamed at over a wrinkled tablecloth 2 weeks earlier. A guest near the back, a woman in a deep green gown, admitted quietly that she had witnessed Vanessa humiliate a valet outside a restaurant months ago and had said nothing at the time because it had not seemed like her place to interfere. Each admission chipped away at the version of the evening Vanessa had tried to build, until the image she had spent months constructing, elegant, composed, worthy of the Whitmore name, collapsed in front of the very people she had wanted to impress most. She looked around the hall for support and found only lowered eyes and uncomfortable silence, the kind of silence that told her more clearly than any accusation could have that the room had already made its decision. Ethan stood very still through all of it, watching the woman he had planned to marry be revealed piece by piece as someone he had never fully allowed himself to see clearly before. He thought back, without meaning to the conversation he had overheard the night before outside the grand hall, the cold certainty in Vanessa's voice when she promised Naomi she would be taught a lesson. He had told himself then that it was nothing, a passing tension between two women who did not get along. He understood now that he had chosen not to look closely at something he already sensed was wrong, and that choice sat uneasily in his chest. "This was never about choosing between the two of you," Ethan finally said, his voice quieter than before but steady. "It's about who I actually am if I stay silent right now." Vanessa's expression shifted from indignation to something closer to desperation. "She's a maid, Ethan," she said, her voice rising. "She works for your family. You cannot possibly let some servant destroy everything we've built over one misunderstanding." The word servant, spoken with such open contempt in front of everyone who had just watched Vanessa strike a defenseless woman twice, seemed to settle the matter for good. Ethan reached down and removed the engagement ring from Vanessa's hand, his movements slow but certain, the ring catching the chandelier light one last time before he closed his fingers around it. "I can't build a marriage with someone who believes money gives her the right to humiliate people and to hurt them whenever she feels entitled to," he said. "I should have said that months ago. I'm saying it now." Vanessa searched the faces around her one final time, waiting for someone, anyone, to step in on her behalf. No one did. The guests who had once competed for invitations to events like this one now simply watched her, some with pity, most with the quiet satisfaction of people who had waited a long time to see her exposed. She turned and walked out of the grand hall alone, her heels echoing against the marble in a silence far more damning than any accusation could have been. Once she was gone, Ethan turned to Naomi, who still stood near the shattered glass, her cheek marked with the fading imprint of Vanessa's hand. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words carried more weight than a simple apology usually would. "I didn't see what you were dealing with in this house. Not clearly, not until tonight. That's on me." Naomi shook her head slightly. "I don't want pity," she said, "and I don't want people suddenly respecting me just because they found out what I used to be capable of. I only ever wanted to be treated like a person, even in this uniform." Harold raised his glass then, addressing the entire hall as though the party had simply shifted into a different kind of occasion. "To Naomi," he said, "not because she could have hurt Vanessa Sterling badly tonight, but because she was strong enough not to." A quiet ripple of applause followed, hesitant at first, then steadier, as more of the household staff stepped forward to stand near her. A silent line of solidarity from people who understood exactly what it felt like to be dismissed as scenery in a room like this one. In the days that followed, Naomi began quietly packing her things, convinced that her presence in the house would only keep the scandal alive. Ethan found her in the small room off the kitchen where she stayed, a single bag half filled on the bed beside her. "You don't have to go," he said, "but I'm also not asking you to stay here as staff. Not after everything." He told her instead that he wanted to help her build whatever life she actually wanted for herself, not the quiet, invisible one she had settled for out of fear, but something she chose freely, without needing to hide any part of who she was. Naomi sat with that offer for a long moment, turning it over in her mind, before allowing herself, for the first time in years, to imagine a future that did not require disappearing into a corner of someone else's house. She decided, in the weeks that followed, to use the training she had once been so afraid of, teaching self-defense and confidence-building classes for young women who had never been given the chance to believe they deserved to feel safe. On the first evening of that program, standing in front of a small group of girls no older than 16, Naomi told them that self-defense did not begin with a punch. It began with believing you had the right to safety, the right to respect, and the right to say the word stop and have it mean something. Her relationship with Ethan grew slowly after that, built not from the moment she had taken Vanessa to the ground, but from years of quiet kitchen conversations that had mattered long before anyone else was watching. One evening, months later, Ethan came down to that same kitchen the way he used to, except this time there was no distance of employer and employee left standing between them, no secret waiting to be discovered. It was there, over the same kind of coffee they had shared 100 times before, that he finally asked her to stay in his life for good, not as staff, and not as someone hiding a past, but simply as herself. A year after that engagement party, Naomi and Ethan were married in that same grand hall, though the room looked almost nothing like it had that night. There were no 300 strangers competing to be noticed, no performance of wealth and status. Instead, there was family, close friends, the household staff, who had once stood silently on the edges of every party, and a group of young women from Naomi's self-defense program, several of them crying openly with pride during the ceremony. Before the wedding began, one of those girls asked Naomi why she had not fought back the moment Vanessa first struck her. Naomi considered the question carefully before answering. Real strength, she told her, was never about the ability to make someone else hurt. It was about knowing exactly when to act, when to hold back, and refusing to let someone else's cruelty turn you into a version of them. The same chandeliers that had once lit the worst moment of her life now shone down on a room full of respect and quiet healing, and as she looked around at everyone gathered there, Naomi understood, finally, that silence and weakness had never been the same thing at all. Never mistake silence for weakness. The people who don't fight back aren't always the ones who can't. Sometimes they're simply the ones strong enough to choose restraint and wise enough to know their moment will come. If this story stayed with you, that's exactly the kind of story we tell here every week. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let us know in the comments what you think real strength looks like. We'll see you in the next one.